Hello friends, we continue then into part 2 of A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. Part 2 as decided by me because, as I said, there are no chapters. There are a couple of footnotes in this as we head into esoterica. Esoterica? Esoterica, I don't know. So I'll read those now and you just have to watch out for the words as I stumble over them later. The first is the footnote to Akeldama. And the footnote says, normally Akeldama with a C rather than a K, very important, literally the field of blood, the potter's field bought with the money Judas obtained for the betrayal of Christ and used for the burial of strangers. So try to bear that in mind. And then later on, we get to talking about Friar Bacon's brazen head, things hung outside shops. Roger Bacon, the medieval philosopher, was reputed to have created such a head capable of prophesying. So you've got that to look forward to. And then Mother Shipton has a footnote. Traditionally a witch with prophetic powers living in Yorkshire in the 15th century. She is supposed to have prophesied the Great Fire of London, which would be the following year, 1666. So let's get back into it. We left it with the narrator dithering about whether to stay in London or leave, as his brother suggests. And then just as he checks the Bible and resolves to stay, he becomes ill. But I had a further obligation laid on me on the same side, for the next day I found myself very much out of order also, so that if I would have gone away, I could not. And I continued ill 3 or 4 days, and this entirely determined my stay. So I took my leave of my brother, who went away to Dorking in Surrey and afterwards fetched around farther into Buckinghamshire or Bedfordshire, to a retreat he had found out there for his family. It was a very ill time to be sick in, for if anyone complained it was immediately said he had the plague, and though I had indeed no symptoms of that distemper, yet being very ill, both in my head and in my stomach, I was not without apprehension that I really was infected. But in about 3 days I grew better. The third night I rested well, sweated a little, and was much refreshed. The apprehensions of it being the infection went also quite away with my illness, and I went about my business as usual. These things, however, put off all my thoughts of going into the country, and my brother also being gone, I had no more debate either with him or with myself on that subject. It was now mid-July, and the plague, which had chiefly raged at the other end of the town, and as I said before in the parishes of St. Giles, St. Andrews, Holborn, and towards Westminster, began to now come eastward towards the part where I lived. It was to be observed, indeed, that it did not come straight on towards us, for the city, that is to say, within the walls, was indifferently healthy still, nor was it got then very much over the water into Southwark, for though there died that week 1,268 of all distempers, whereof it might be supposed above 900 died of the plague, yet there was but 28 in the whole city, within the walls, and but 19 in Southwark, Lambeth parish included, whereas in the parishes of St. Giles and St. Martin in the Fields alone, there died 421. But we perceived the infection kept chiefly in the out parishes, which being very populous, and fuller also of poor, the distemper found more to prey upon than in the city, as I shall observe afterwards. We perceived, I say, the distemper to draw our way, viz. By the parishes of Clerkenwell, Cripplegate, Shoreditch, and Bishopsgate, which last 2 parishes joining to Aldgate, Whitechapel, and Stepney. The infection came at length to spread its utmost rage and violence in those parts, even when it abated at the western parishes where it began. It was very strange to observe that in this particular week, from the 4th to the 11th of July, when, as I have observed, there died near 400 of the plague in the 2 parishes of St. Martin and St. Giles in the Fields only, there died in the parish of Aldgate but 4, in the parish of Whitechapel 3, in the parish of Stepney but 1. Likewise in the next week, from the 11th of July to the 18th, when the week's bill was 1,761, yet there died no more of the plague on the whole Southwark side of the water than 16. But this face of things soon changed, and it began to thicken in Cripplegate parish especially, and in Clerkenwell, so that by the 2nd week in August, Cripplegate parish alone buried 886, and Clerkenwell 155. Of the first, 850 might well be reckoned to die of the plague, and of the last, the bill itself said 145 were of the plague. During the month of July, and while, as I have observed, our part of the town seemed to be spared in comparison of the west part, I went ordinarily about the streets as my business required, and particularly went generally once in a day, or in 2 days, into the city, to my brother's house, which he had given me charge of, to see if it was safe. And having the key in my pocket, I used to go into the house and over most of the rooms to see that all was well. For though it be something wonderful to tell that any should have hearts so hardened in the midst of such a calamity as to rob and steal, yet certain it is that all sorts of villainies, and even levities and debaucheries, were then practised in the town as openly as ever. I will not say quite as frequently, because the numbers of people were many ways lessened. But the city itself began now to be visited too. I mean, within the walls. But the number of people there indeed extremely lessened by so great a multitude having been gone into the country, and even all this month of July they continued to flee, though not in such multitudes as formerly. In August, indeed, they fled in such a manner that I began to think there would be really none but magistrates and servants left in the city. As they fled now out of the city, so I should observe that the court, the royal court, removed early, viz. In the month of June, and went to Oxford, where it pleased God to preserve them, and the distemper did not, as I heard of, so much as touch them, for which I cannot say that I ever saw they showed any great token of thankfulness, or hardly anything of reformation, though they did not want being told that their crying vices might, without breach of charity, be said to have gone far in bringing that terrible judgment upon the whole nation. The face of London was now indeed strangely altered. I mean the whole mass of buildings, city, liberties, suburbs, Westminster, Southwark, and all together. For as the particular part called the city, or within the walls, that was not yet much infected, but in the whole the face of things, I say, was much altered. Sorrow and sadness sat upon every face, and though some parts were not yet overwhelmed, yet all looked deeply concerned. And as he saw it apparently coming on, so everyone looked on himself and his family as in the utmost danger. Were it possible to represent those times exactly to those that did not see them, and give the reader due ideas of the horror that everywhere presented itself, it must make just impressions upon their minds, and fill them with surprise. London might well be said to be all in tears. The mourners did not go about the streets indeed, for nobody put on black or made a formal dress of mourning for their nearest friends, but the voice of mourners was truly heard in the streets. The shrieks of women and children at the windows and doors of their houses, where their dearest relations were perhaps dying, or just dead, was so frequent to be heard as we passed the streets that it was enough to pierce the stoutest heart in the world to hear them. Tears and lamentations were seen almost in every house, especially in the first part of the visitation, for towards the latter end men's hearts were hardened, and death was so always before their eyes that they did not so much concern themselves for the loss of their friends, expecting that themselves should be summoned the next hour. Business led me out sometimes to the other end of the town, even when the sickness was chiefly there, and as the thing was new to me, as well as to everybody else, it was a most surprising thing to see those streets which were usually so thronged now grown desolate, and so few people to be seen in them, that if I had been a stranger and at a loss for my way, I might sometimes have gone the lengths of a whole street, I mean of the by-streets, and seen nobody to direct me except watchmen set at the doors of such houses as were shut up, of which I shall speak presently. One day, being at that part of the town on some special business, curiosity led me to observe things more than usually, and indeed I walked a great way where I had no business. I went up Holborn, and there the street was full of people, but they walked in the middle of the great street, neither on one side or other, because as I suppose they would not mingle with anybody that came out of houses, or meet with smells and scent from houses that might be infected. The inns of court were all shut up, nor were many of the lawyers in the Temple, or Lincoln's Inn, or Gray's Inn, to be seen there. Everybody was at peace, there was no occasion for lawyers. Besides, it being in the time of vacation too, they were generally gone into the country. Whole rows of houses in some places were shut close up, the inhabitants all fled, and only a watchman or two left. When I speak of rows of houses being shut up, I do not mean shut up by the magistrates, but that great numbers of persons followed the court by the necessity of their employments and other dependencies, and as others retired, really frightened with the distemper, it was a mere desolating of some of the streets. But the fright was not yet so near great in the city. But the fright was not yet near so great in the city, abstractly so called, and particularly because, though they were at first in most inexpressible consternation, yet as I have observed that the distemper intermitted often at first, so they were, as it were, alarmed and unalarmed again, and this several times, till it began to be familiar to them, and that even when it appeared violent, yet seeing it did not presently spread into the city, or the east end and south parts, the people began to take courage, and to be, as I may say, a little hardened. It is true a vast many fled, as I have observed, yet they were chiefly from the west end of the town, and from what we call the heart of the city, that is to say, among the wealthiest of the people, and such people as were unencumbered with trades and business. But of the rest, the generality stayed, and seemed to abide the worst, so that in the place we call the Liberties, and in the suburbs, in Southwark, and in the east part, such as Wapping, Ratcliffe, Stepney, Rotherhithe, and the like, the people generally stayed, except here and there a few wealthy families who, as above, did not depend on their business. It must not be forgot here that the city and suburbs were prodigiously full of people at this time of the visitation, I mean at the time that it began, for though I have lived to see a further increase and mighty throngs of people settling in London more than ever, yet we always had a notion that the numbers of people which, the wars being over, the armies disbanded, and the royal family and the monarchy being restored, had flocked to London to settle in business or to depend upon and attend the court for rewards, services, preferments, and the like, was such that the town was computed to have in it above 100,000 people more than ever it held before. Nay, some took upon them to say it had twice as many, because all the ruined families of the royal party flocked hither. All the soldiers set up trades here, and abundance of families settled here. Again, the court brought with them a great flux of pride and new fashions. All people were grown gay and luxurious, and the joy of the Restoration had brought a vast many families to London. I often thought that as Jerusalem was besieged by the Romans when the Jews were assembled together to celebrate the Passover, by which means an incredible number of people were surprised there who would otherwise have been in other countries, so the plague entered London when an incredible increase of people had happened occasionally by the particular circumstances above named. As this conflux of the people to a youthful and gay court made a great trade in the city, especially in everything that belonged to fashion and finery, so it drew by consequence a great number of workmen, manufacturers, and the like, being mostly poor people who depended upon their labour. And I remember in particular that in a representation to my Lord Mayor of the condition of the poor, it was estimated there were no less than 100,000 riband weavers in and about the city, the chiefest number of whom lived then in the parishes of Shoreditch, Stepney, Whitechapel, and Bishopsgate, that, namely, about Spitalfields. That is to say, as Spitalfields was then, for it was not so large as now by 1/5 part. By this, however, the number of people in the whole may be judged of, and indeed I have often wondered that after the prodigious numbers of people that went away at first, there was yet so great a multitude left as it appeared there was. But I must go back again to the beginning of this surprising time. While the fears of the people were young, they were increased strangely by several odd accidents which, put all together, it was really a wonder the whole body of the people did not rise as one man and abandon their dwellings, leaving the place as a space of ground designed by heaven for an Akeldama, doomed to be destroyed from the face of the earth, and that all would be found in it would perish with it. I shall name but a few of these things, but sure there were so many, and so many wizards and cunning people propagating them, that I have often wondered there was any, women especially, left behind. In the first place, a blazing star, or comet, appeared for several months before the plague, as there did the year after another a little before the fire. The old women and phlegmatic hypochondriac part of the other sex, whom I could almost call old women too, remarked, especially afterward, though not till both those judgments were over, that those two comets passed directly over the city, and that so very near the houses that it was plain they imported something peculiar to the city alone, that the comet before the pestilence was of a faint, dull, languid colour, and its motion very heavy, solemn, and slow, and that the comet before the fire was bright and sparkling, as others said, flaming, and its motion swift and furious, and that accordingly one foretold a heavy judgment, slow but severe, terrible and frightful, as was the plague, but the other foretold a stroke, sudden, swift, and fiery as the conflagration. Nay, so particular some people were, that as they looked upon that comet preceding the fire, they fancied that they not only saw it pass swiftly and fiercely, and could perceive the motion with their eye, but even they heard it, that it made a rushing mighty noise, fierce and terrible, though at a distance, and but just perceivable. I saw both these stars, and, I must confess, had so much of the common notion of such things in my head, that I was apt to look upon them as the forerunners and warnings of God's judgments, and especially when, after the plague had followed the first, I yet saw another of the like kind, I could not but say God had not yet sufficiently scourged the city. But I could not at the same time carry those things to the height that others did, knowing too that natural causes are assigned by the astronomers for such things, and that their motions and even their revolutions are calculated, or pretended to be calculated, so that they cannot be so perfectly called the forerunners or foretellers, much less the procurers of such events as pestilence, war, fire, and the like. But let my thoughts and the thoughts of the philosophers be, or have been, what they will. These things had a more than ordinary influence upon the minds of the common people, and they had almost universal melancholy apprehensions of some dreadful calamity and judgment coming upon the city, and this principally from the sight of this comet, and the little alarm that was given in December by 2 people dying at St. Giles, as above. The apprehensions of the people were likewise strangely increased by the error of the times, in which I think the people, from what principle I cannot imagine, were more addicted to prophecies and astrological conjurations, dreams and old wives' tales, than ever they were before or since. Whether this unhappy temper was originally raised by the follies of some people who got money by it, that is to say, by printing predictions and prognostications, I know not, but certain it is, books frighted them terribly, such as Lilly's Almanac, Gadbury's Astrological Predictions, Poor Robin's Almanac, and the like. Also several pretended religious books, one entitled Come Out of Her, My People, Lest You Be Partaker of Her Plagues, another called Fair Warning, another Britain's Remembrancer, and many such, all or most part of which foretold, directly or covertly, the ruin of the city. Nay, some were so enthusiastically bold as to run about the streets with their oral predictions, pretending they were sent to preach to the city, and one in particular, who, like Jonah to Nineveh, cried in the streets, "Yet 40 days, and London shall be destroyed." I will not be positive whether he said, "Yet 40 days," or "Yet a few days." Another ran about naked, except a pair of drawers about his waist, crying day and night, like a man that Josephus mentions, who cried, "Woe to Jerusalem," a little before the destruction of that city. So this poor naked creature cried, "Oh, the great and dreadful God!" and said no more, but repeated those words continually, with a voice and countenance full of horror, a swift pace, and nobody could ever find him to stop or rest, or take any sustenance, at least that ever I could hear of. I met this poor creature several times in the streets, and would have spoken to him, but he would not enter into speech with me or anyone else, but held on his dismal cries continually. These things terrified the people to the last degree, and especially when 2 or 3 times, as I have mentioned already, they found 1 or 2 in the bills dead of the plague at St. Giles's. Next to these public things were the dreams of old women, or, I should say, the interpretations of old women upon other people's dreams. And these put abundance of people even out of their wits. Some heard voices warning them to be gone, for that there would be such a plague in London, so that the living would not be able to bury the dead. Others saw apparitions in the air, and I must be allowed to say of both, I hope without breach of charity, that they heard voices that never spoke, and saw sights that never appeared. But the imagination of the people was really turned wayward and possessed, and no wonder if they who were poring continually as the clouds saw shapes and figures, representations and appearances which had nothing in them but air and vapour. Here they told us they saw a flaming sword held in a hand coming out of a cloud, with a point hanging directly over the city. There they saw hearses and coffins in the air carrying to be buried, and there again heaps of dead bodies lying unburied and the like, just as the imagination of the poor terrified people furnished them with matter to work upon. So hypochondriac fancies represent ships' armies, battles in the firmament, till steady eyes the exaltation solve, and all to its first matter, cloud, resolve. I could feel this account with the strange relation such people gave every day of what they'd seen, and everyone was so positive of their having seen what they pretended to see that there was no contradicting them without breach of friendship, or being accounted rude and unmanly on the one hand, and profane and impenetrable on the other. One time before the plague was begun, otherwise than as I was at in St. Giles, I think it was March, seeing a crowd of people in the street, I joined with them to satisfy my curiosity, and found them all staring up into the air to see what a woman told them appeared plain to her, which was an angel clothed in white, with a fiery sword in his hand, waving it or brandishing it over his head. She described every part of the figure to the life, showed them the motion and the form, and the poor people came into it so regularly and with such eagerness and readiness. "Yes, I see it all plainly," says one. "There's the sword, as plain as can be." Another saw the angel. One saw his very face and cried out what a glorious creature he was. One saw one thing and one another. I looked as earnestly as the rest, but perhaps not with so much willingness to be imposed upon, and I said indeed that I could see nothing but a white cloud, bright on one side by the shining of the sun, upon the other part. The woman endeavoured to show it me, but could not make me confess that I saw it, which indeed, if I had, I must have lied. But the woman, turning upon me, looked in my face, and fancied I laughed, in which her imagination deceived her too, for I really did not laugh, but was very seriously reflecting how the poor people were terrified by the force of their own imagination. However, she turned from me, called me profane fellow and a scoffer, told me that it was time of God's anger, and dreadful judgments were approaching, and that despisers such as I should wander and perish. The people about her seemed disgusted as well as she, and I found there was no persuading them that I did not laugh at them, and that I should be rather mobbed by them than be able to undeceive them. So I left them, and this appearance passed for as real as the blazing star itself. Another encounter I had, in the open day also, and this was in going through a narrow passage from Petty France into Bishopsgate churchyard by a row of almshouses. There are two churchyards to Bishopsgate church or parish. One we go over to pass from the place called Petty France into Bishopsgate Street, coming out just by the church door. The other is on the side of the narrow passage where the almshouses are on the left, and a dwarf wall with a palisado in it on the right hand, and the city wall on the other side more to the right. In this narrow passage stands a man looking through between the palisadoes into the burying place. I don't know how to pronounce palisadoes. Between the palisadoes into the burying place, and as many people as the narrowness of the passage would admit to stop without hindering the passage of others, and he was talking mightily eagerly to them, and pointing now to one place, then to another, and affirming that he saw a ghost walking upon such a gravestone there. He described the shape, the posture, and the movement of it so exactly that it was the greatest matter of amazement to him in the world that everybody did not see it as well as he. On a sudden he would cry, "There it is! Now it comes this way!" Then just turn back, till at length he persuaded the people into so firm a belief of it that one fancied he saw it, and another fancied he saw it, and thus he came every day, making a strange hubbub, considering it was in so narrow a passage, till Bishopsgate clock struck 11, and then the ghost would seem to start, and, as if he were called away, disappeared on a sudden. I looked earnestly every way, and at the very moment that this man directed, but could not see the least appearance of anything. But so positive was this poor man that he gave the people the vapours in abundance, and sent them away trembling and frightened, till at length few people that knew of it cared to go through that passage, and hardly anybody by night, on any account whatsoever. This ghost, as the poor man affirmed, made signs to the houses, and to the ground, and to the people, plainly intimating, or else they so understanding it, that abundance of the people should come to be buried in that churchyard, as indeed happened. That he saw such aspects, I must acknowledge, I never believed, nor could I see anything of it myself, though I looked most earnestly to see it, if possible. These things served to show how far the people were really overcome with delusions, and as they had a notion of the approach of a visitation, all their predictions ran upon a most dreadful plague, which should lay the whole city, and even the kingdom waste, and should destroy almost all the nation, both man and beast. To this, as I said before, the astrologers added stories of the conjunctions of planets in a malignant manner and with a mischievous influence, one of which conjunctions was to happen, and did happen, in October, and the other in November, and they filled the people's heads with predictions on those signs of the heavens, intimating that those conjunctions foretold drought, famine, and pestilence. In the two first of them, however, they were entirely mistaken, for we had no droughty season, but in the beginning of the year a hard frost which lasted from December almost to March, and after that moderate weather, rather warm than hot, with refreshing winds, and, in short, very seasonable weather, and also several very great rains. Some endeavours were used to suppress the printing of such books as terrified the people, and to frighten the dispersers of them, some of whom were taken up. But nothing was done in it, as I am informed, the government being unwilling to exasperate the people, who were, as I may say, all out of their wits already. Neither can I acquit those ministers that in their sermons rather sank than lifted up the hearts of their hearers. Many of them no doubt did it for the strengthening the resolution of the people, and especially for quickening them to repentance, but it certainly answered not their end, at least not in proportion to the injury it did another way. And indeed, as God himself through the whole Scriptures rather draws to him by invitations and calls to turn to him and live, than drives us by terror and amazement, so I must confess I thought the ministers should have done also, imitating our blessed Lord and Master in this, that his whole gospel is full of declarations from heaven of God's mercy, and his readiness to receive penitents and forgive them, complaining, "Ye will not come unto me that ye may have life," and that therefore his gospel is called the gospel of peace and the gospel of grace. But we had some good men, and that of all persuasions and opinions, whose discourses were full of terror, who spoke nothing but dismal things, and as they brought the people together with a kind of horror, sent them away in tears, prophesying nothing but evil tidings, terrifying the people with the apprehensions of being utterly destroyed, not guiding them, at least not enough, to cry to heaven for mercy. It was indeed a time of very unhappy breaches among us in matters of religion. Innumerable sects and divisions and separate opinions prevailed among the people. The Church of England was restored, indeed, with the restoration of the monarchy about 4 years before, but the ministers and preachers of the Presbyterians and Independents, and of all the other sorts of professions, had begun to gather separate societies and erect altar against altar, and all those had their meetings for worship apart, as they have now, but not so many then, the dissenters being not thoroughly formed into a body as they are since, and those congregations which were thus gathered together were yet but few. And even those that were, the government did not allow, but endeavoured to suppress them and shut up their meetings. But the visitation reconciled them again, at least for a time, and many of the best and most valuable ministers and preachers of the dissenters were suffered to go into churches where the incumbents were fled away, as many were, not being able to stand it, and the people flocked without distinction to hear them preach, not much inquiring who or what opinion they were of. But after the sickness was over, that spirit of charity abated, and every church being again supplied with their own ministers, or others presented where the minister was dead, things returned to their old channel again. One mischief always introduces another. These terrors and apprehensions of the people led them into 1,000 weak, foolish, and wicked things, which they wanted not a sort of people really wicked to encourage them to. And this was running about to fortune-tellers, cunning men and astrologers to know their fortune, or as it is vulgarly expressed, to have their fortunes told them, their nativities calculated, and the like. And this folly presently made the town swarm with a wicked generation of pretenders to the magic, to the black art, as they called it, and I know not what, nay, to 1,000 worse dealings with the devil than they were really guilty of. And this trade grew so open and so generally practised that it became common to have signs and inscriptions set up at doors. Here lives a fortune-teller. Here lives an astrologer. Here you may have your nativity calculated, and the like. And Friar Bacon's brazen head, which was the usual sign of these people's dwellings, was to be seen almost in every street, or else the sign of Mother Shipton, or of Merlin's head, and the like. With what blind, absurd, and ridiculous stuff these oracles of the devil pleased and satisfied the people, I really know not, but certain it is that innumerable attendants crowded about their doors every day, and if but a grave fellow in a velvet jacket, a band, and a black coat, which was the habit of these quack conjurers generally went in, was but seen in the streets, the people would follow them in crowds and ask them questions as they went along. I need not mention what a horrid delusion this was, or what it tended to, but there was no remedy for it till the plague itself put an end to it all, and I suppose cleared the town of most of those calculators themselves. One mischief was that if the poor people asked these mock astrologers whether there would be a plague or no, they all agreed in general to answer yes, for that kept up their trade. And had the people not been kept in a fright about that, the wizards would presently have been rendered useless, and their craft had been at an end. But they always talked to them of such and such influences of the stars, of conjunctions of such and such planets, which must necessarily bring sickness and distempers, and consequently the plague. And some had the assurance to tell them the plague was begun already, which was too true, though they that said it knew nothing of the matter. The ministers, to do them justice, and preachers of most sorts that were serious and understanding persons, thundered against these and other wicked practices, and exposed the folly as well as the wickedness of them together, and the most sober and judicious people despised and abhorred them. But it was impossible to make any impression upon the middling people and the working, labouring poor. Their fears were predominant over all their passions, and they threw away their money in a most distracted manner upon those whimsies. Maidservants especially, and men-servants, were the chief of their customers, and their question generally was, after the first demand of, "Will there be a plague?" the next question was, "O sir, for the Lord's sake, what will become of me? Will my mistress keep me, or will she turn me off? Will she stay here, or will she go into the country? And if she goes into the country, will she take me with her, or leave me here to be starved and undone?" And the like of men-servants. And page 48, that's where I'll stop. Yes, so at the same time again tomorrow. I hope everyone is doing very well. All right, lots of love. Bye-bye.